പോപ്കോണിൽ ഇന്ന് വെസ്റ്റ്മിൻസ്റ്റർ സർവകലാശാലയിലെ സെന്റർ ഫോർ സ്റ്റഡി ഓഫ് ഡെമോക്രസിയുടെ ഡയറക്ടറായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രൊഫസർ നിതാഷ കൗളുമായുള്ള അഭിമുഖം കേൾക്കാം. അവതരണം കാലിക്കറ്റ് സർവകലാശാല പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ സയൻസ് വിഭാഗം മേധാവിയായ ഡോക്ടർ സാബു തോമസ്.
Good evening. Welcome Professor Nitasha Kaul to University of Calicut. And as your area of research is, as you are from the Center of Study for Democracy at University of Westminster, London, I think that I can start asking you about your experience of democracy, particularly as you are researching on the democracy in India. So can you tell us how you feel about how you are experiencing democracy in India?
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here at the University of Calicut and to have interacted with your colleagues, with your students. I found that to be a very enriching experience. To answer your question, democracy is, as we know, if it's not the best, but it's certainly the least worst system that we have. And as someone who is a professor of politics, international relations and critical interdisciplinary studies and the director of a center for the study of democracy, which was in fact established in 1989, so a long established center, democracy is actually something that is of deep and enduring interest to me. And democratic erosion, believe it or not, in various parts of the world, including in India, is actually something that sometimes keeps me awake at night. I worry about democracy because I feel that the journey of democracy is not the simple one. It's not that it happened in Greece and then it came through to us and it's just progress onwards and upwards evermore. There are much more interesting, complex histories of democracy, as in fact a former colleague of mine and Professor John Keane wrote, but also others, that democracy is actually a global inheritance, that there have been different parts of the world going back to the ancient times when, where in all of these different places where people have manifested the desire to actually have representation, to actually have a say, to actually be able to exercise what their rights are, even if they didn't use the vocabulary of rights or democracy or such. So therefore, first of all, that the story of democracy is long and complex and global. But secondly, the fact that in the present, we cannot take it for granted that just because we have had established, parliamentary liberal democracy that has happened in that has taken root in many countries, that it's going to stay the way. Because what we see globally is that actually, I don't have the statistics to hand, but surveys tell us that most of the majority of the world right now is experiencing either outright totalitarian regimes or regimes that are hybrid and mixed, or regimes where democracy is actually undergoing a crisis or being eroded. So therefore, thinking about democracy has never been as urgent as it is right now. And India, as the world's largest democracy, in fact, as if we were to look at the official line, it's called the mother of democracy. We in all of those G20 posters. So we have to think really, what does that democracy mean on the ground for a range of people? Because democracy is about political majorities, right? Not ethnic majorities. It's democracy is a system where in its substantive, significant form, it's more than just elections. It's not just the procedures that we have in election. It means thinking seriously about who constitutes the election commission, how are minority rights influenced, how is free speech protected, all of the various things that India has very good cause to historically be proud of. Are we managing to protect that today? And therefore, the worry with democratic erosion is something that is a part of, in the Indian context, but not only in the Indian context, is something that is definitely on my mind all the time.
Okay, you are right. When you are talking about democracy in India, I think I had some slight argument with you, particularly about the grounds, democracy in the grounds. So democracy is to be an experience rather than institutions, as you said. But the Indian experience on democracy or Indian tradition of democracy, apart from this saying that India is the mother of democracy, our experience with democracy is very short. So when you are evaluating Indian democracy, maybe looking at it at par with the European experiments, so that makes a lot of difference. We are in the other end of the story, and we are just beginning. 75 or 76 or 77 years is nothing to a democratic system when you come to the European system. You compare this to the European experiments. So Indian democracy has that kind of inbuilt issues, maybe I would like to say the childhood issues. So it's more about experiencing, as you said, it's experiencing democracy. So that experience is yet to reach, apart from this peripheral institutions.
Right. So I will, I will push back on the idea that I'm comparing India with the West or with any other democracy, because that's simply not what I'm interested in. So it isn't. In fact, I would like to make that very clear. It isn't that anywhere democracy has been fully achieved and has solved its problem. Right? All the problems, and there's no erosion. So democracy is undergoing various kinds of challenges, both in long-established democracies, as well as in newer democracies, as well as in consolidating democracies. The challenges are different, but the thing that makes the Indian case significant is, first of all, it's a bellwether for a lot of other democracies because it's a large democracy. It's the world's largest democracy, in fact. So it's important, therefore. It's a very important post-colonial democracy, one of the countries that has had a role on the world stage, especially after the mid-20th century, as a place where various kinds of ideals around secularism, pluralism, it's never been a theocracy. So those kinds of things have been historically really important. So I'm not comparing India to the West. I'm comparing India in the present to India as it ought to be and to India as it was. And that challenge, the challenge of erosion is there in that experience of democracy, which today, if we look at very objective indicators, things like media freedom, things like rankings of democracy, those kinds of things, which are kind of statistical things, objective things. But then also, as you rightly say, the idea of experience, and in fact, the title that of my workshop here today was Writing Politics, Experiencing Politics. So the experience of democracy cannot only be seen from the point of view of those who don't have vulnerabilities, right? So we have to look at the experience of democracy from the point of view of minorities, from the point of view of people who don't have privileged castes or privileged gender or those sorts of things. So their experience today would seem to tell us that there is cause to be thinking seriously and perhaps worry about the future trajectory of Indian democracy, because as anyone who cares for democracy should obviously care for its future in the world's largest democracy.
Okay, thank you. That's a interesting point. Here I think that there's one more point about democracy, because I feel that democracy has been too much hibernated. Maybe I think that there are too much expectations about democracy. People think that it's something ideal or the end point of maybe a political goal. So democracy cannot never be the best. There is nothing what you call as ideal. So there are too much expectations on this system, whatever it is. So I think that's also another problem. People, whenever you get into a democratic system, you think that your problems are being solved. But as Ambedkar said in a earlier period, it's about bringing social democracy. It's not about political democracy. So it's not an easy task in any way, particularly a country like India with, as you said, this kind of population, this kind of area. So do you think that this is going to be a huge task for the government, for the society?
Not for the government, because I think democracy is the preserve of citizens. So is it a huge, humongous, very difficult, gigantic task for the citizens? Absolutely. For all the citizens of India and for the citizens of the world and citizens of nowhere and people who care for democracy irrespective of national boundaries, it's really important to look at how democracy is being undermined. And in fact, democracy today is being undermined in the name of democracy itself. Legality is not undermined in the old usual way of outright totalitarianisms, but legality evermore, the strategy everywhere has been to undermine laws and undermine institutions in the name of reforming and improving laws and institutions. So there's that thing to think about, that there is genuine cause for worry if we look at the ways in which the role of finance, the role of algorithmic kinds of manipulation, the role of the ability, accountability, executive accountability, all of these are serious worries. So that's one point, and citizens, engaged citizens should care for that. The second point that relates to this is that it's not just an Indian problem. It is an Indian problem, but not only an Indian problem. And that's relevant to recognize, not simply to say that, well, yes, it happens everywhere. Of course it does, because nowhere is perfect. And, it's not as if, going back, I'll come back to this point, but it's not like there is a teleology, when you earlier said, like, infancy and that kind of thing. It's not like a teleology. That's what I was trying to challenge, that if you leave it to its own devices, there's no guarantee that human societies will keep getting more rights. They might just reverse and actually get less rights, as we see has happened in many cases. So there's that. But so it happens in lots of places. Coming back to what I was saying earlier, it happens in other places, and it is happening in other places. But the thing to note is also that if we only look at this within national boundaries, whether India or UK or US or Philippines or Brazil, then we are missing the ways in which there are complex interconnections, such as, for instance, the role of diaspora in politics in any country, such as, for instance, the very clear links between various kinds of global right-wing leaders that we saw at one point in time with Bolsonaro, with Trump, with Modi. And again, this is nothing to do simply with any one particular kind of even religion or region. In a paper in the International Studies Review that, that has received a lot of attention, my paper, it's called The Misogyny of Authoritarians in Contemporary Democracies, I show exactly how, whether you're talking about a Muslim majority country like Turkey, talking about a Hindu majority country like India, or, officially, like, not everyone identifies, but yeah, Hindu majority country like India, whether you're talking about Philippines, whether you're talking about Brazil, whether you're talking about the US, seen as the leader of the free world. In all of these countries, democracy has had problems with a certain kind of populist leadership that has presented to the people the ideal, the strongman ideal of, of the future as the return to a kind of golden past in each of these cases, whether it's Make America Great Again or let's go back to our glorious past, but which is a great promise. Who doesn't want to feel proud about their country and their identity and all of that? It's a great promise. But the thing is, those promises come with with various kinds of other attached, it's a poison chalice in that. It comes with various other kinds of politics of either hate or division or othering, that, we are the real citizens, we are the proper ones, we are the rightful ones, the others have to live on our terms, and that's always a problem. You're right in that. Has democracy been burdened with too much? Is it a dream that we can never realize? Perhaps, but it's still an ideal. I mean, maybe I think the things that are really worth fighting for are the things that where we are not sure we are going to win, but we know they are important, because the human person who wants to be able to have their rights and freedoms and they fail and they still keep trying, because that's the history of the world.
Surely. I think that you should have dreams. Okay, you should have certain ideals. That's okay. Democracy is in that level. It should be the real ideal. Okay, when we talk about democracy, the another side of the issue, gender. I think that you are being the first woman director of this institute. I think so. So I think that how you evaluate democracy in a gender perspective, particularly, we come to the Kerala context, maybe to a micro level, how you will evaluate the gender issues in Kerala, particularly with regard to democracy.
So, thank you. I mean, it's always, when you break glass ceilings, when you're the first female professor in so many years, when you're the first, director in decades, all of those things, like, and that has been, it's not something that I've just done. I remember how vitiated the environment was when at a very elite Delhi University College at SRCC, when I stood as the, for the president of Economic Society, I actually got rape threats. So, just for something at that level. So you can imagine that when you think about the level of national politics, regional politics, significant positions, how difficult it is for people who don't come from established identities to be able to create their space. So there's that. But on the matter of gender, since you asked me, I mean, firstly, again, a few disclaimers are in order. One, patriarchy does not have a phenotype. There's no one kind of person globally who does patriarchy, or one kind of identity or skin color. It's like there are versions of patriarchy that are globally present, and they manifest themselves differently in different societies. So nowhere do we have the answer. So it's not about comparing one society against another. So firstly, that disclaimer. Secondly, that while the kind of gender inequities are about the idea of differential standards and treatments and experiences of men and women, it doesn't necessarily always neatly overlap with men and women, because gender is not just about women. It's not code for women. Gender is about men and women. It's about, actually, as in that misogyny work that I've written about, and in fact, if you just put the words misogyny and democracy into Google, it's the first thing that comes up. The gender is actually a relationship of power itself in how things are designated, so that something that is sought to be devalued is actually feminized, even in terms of the language we use about it. If we want to devalue something, we'll kind of feminize it. So that and that devalued thing could also be a man, right? So it's not straightforward. Firstly, for those sorts of reasons, because it's not about simply about individual men and women. It's about, kind of feminization as a prelude to devaluation. So there's that. And then there's also the ways in which it can manifest itself in complex ways. So that, for instance, misogyny can be internalized by women themselves. And often in patriarchal societies, that is how the status quo persists and kind of reproduces itself, by that internalization. So just to clarify that, and this is part of my published work, but the difference is like patriarchy and misogyny and sexism, they're not all the same things. Patriarchy is a system. The philosopher Kate Mann, who's talked about the difference between sexism and misogyny. Sexism is the justificatory branch of patriarchy. It says this is what men should do, this is what women should do. Misogyny is the policing branch of patriarchy. If women don't do what they're supposed to do, then you either get verbal abuse or physical abuse or ostracism or differential treatment. So there's it always, so it's important to appreciate these differences. And what always strikes me is that you speak to the average person on the street and you try to get them to see, look how gendered the public sphere is. Who can be out, who can exercise their freedoms in this way, who can travel in this way, who has to be careful. All of this, it's all very specific. And they'll come back and they'll start making like Facebook level arguments about, but women rule the world or something like that, when you look at like seriously territorial conflict. Sure. But, and my point is that this has to be part of something that we think critically about. I won't go up to an engineer and say, actually, engineering is XYZ, because I'd be expected to have studied something about engineering before pronouncing a statement on it. But people think that decades of work on gender theory, on feminist theory, they'll simply ignore all that and pretend it doesn't exist and then put forward, but I believe. So it's at that level of very crude assertion. And Kerala has, like many societies with left-wing progressive parties that have had a prominent position, in here it's Kerala, but also historically, if we look at leftist societies globally, that they have had this very strong focus on like women empowerment, etc. And they've kind of done that. However, that doesn't mean that at an everyday level, it's kind of, it's not a problem for women. If we look at the gendered public sphere, if we look at the ways in which, even simply in my interactions with people, if a woman is with a man, the priority would be given to the man in addressing it. Women have to bear the double burden of housework very often, of childcare. If any kind of macroeconomic shocks happen, such as recession or pandemics or something, the expected care providers are women who are part of the informal part-time labor force, and where they mostly predominate, would be then disproportionately affected by those job losses. So there's a whole range of macro as well as micro ways in which gender, like other identity characteristics, is a relevant part of our world, and it shapes our experiences and it shapes our outcomes, our life chances. And there's no simple fix to it. It's not just that if you educate the daughters, if you do this, if you do that everything will get solved, because it won't. As any parent of any a person who can tell you that it's not that simple. Just picking up a newspaper and opening it is like a catalogue of a very gendered violence, including against minor girls. So in that sense, Kerala is not it's not, it can't congratulate itself and think, oh, well, there's no problem with Kerala. Because as I say, counterfactuals are a great way to imagine how things might be. And if you imagine, what if we just imagined a world where every minister who was a man was a woman, and every minister who was a or a police officer or whatever, you would get you would just get a whole different view of the world. And then for a man to imagine, what would it like that's what we experience every day.
I think that we have to start talking about celebrating gender instead of glorifying, maybe, as you said. Even the use of the term woman empowerment is also dangerous.
Why?
Because you are already empowered means you are not already empowered. The society has to do something.
No, but the women's empowerment is not done in order to empower women. That's done in order for male politicians and some female politicians to claim having done something. That doesn't mean that they are empowering them. In fact, and it's not as if there isn't a dearth of people who worked, feminists and others who worked on this for a long time, to be able to know what to do. I mean, you have to have, start education from a very basic level, from like very childhood level, for people to understand and inculcate that there should not be differential standards, that between boys and girls in terms of their expectations, what they should do in life, what sorts of opportunities they should get. The point of a person's life is not, it can be whatever they want to be. If their point of their life is just to marry and have kids, that's fine. But that cannot be a choice that is imposed upon them. Likewise in marital relationships. I
think we have to break this internalization first.
And that comes from systemic education. There's you cannot tackle, for instance, racism or sexism without acknowledging that it exists in the first place. And there's no shame in acknowledging that it exists. The problem is that people take a defensive stance to it, and they're like, no, we're good, this is somebody else's problem. So it's not, nobody expects anyone, anywhere, any society or individual to be perfect, but the point is to acknowledge and to learn from those experiences. It's especially when there is objective evidence. I opened the newspaper just 2 days ago. Minor girl in Andhra Pradesh, gang raped by people, dies of her, succumbs of her injury. That's like a little item on page 7. And how many such instances happen all over a country? What does that tell us about how we are looking at women? And the problem here is that there's a very deeply ingrained idea of looking at women and property. Men as protectors, women and property on the other side. And then not just women and property, sometimes women as property, if you take it to the extreme, that women are the possession of men and women and property are things that men protect. It creates an unfair situation for men who are supposed to act as protectors in all of those situations, instead of living their lives. And likewise, it creates a situation where women feel like where women are also, unless they internalize it, feel like they are restricted in being able to express themselves.
They have to be protected.
Precisely, that they have to be protected and instead of being able to act upon their own thing. So this kind of thing is just something that has to systemically happen in terms of how people think about, of how people think that gender can just be about men and women without being a hierarchy associated with it, a superiority or an inferiority or a conformity associated with it, so that people can have, their own ways of realizing themselves. And this is not just it's not Kerala is not, let me put it this way, Kerala is not immune from this problem. It very much manifests itself in public spaces, in various kinds of things, and all of that can coexist along with government schemes, which happens in every country. So it's not the worst, obviously. There is the outcomes, but it's also not, it also doesn't give us any reason to be absolutely complacent about it, because these kinds of things can become, used as political strategies. And there is, as I've in my current work, which dwells at the intersection of politics and psychology, that I've been working on with a psychology colleague of mine. We're looking at the ways in which attitudes to climate change and attitudes to gender are correlated. So one of our papers published in the analysis of social issues and public policy, the journal, is called Misogyny, Authoritarianism and Climate Change. And we find, we're looking at the US case, that there is a clear correlation between attitudes to authoritarian dispositions, attitudes towards women, and attitudes towards climate change. In that, they come as a package. So if you think you don't care, you typically don't care for a whole set of those things. And therefore, I mean, I think that both in and of itself, as well as in relation to other things, it is important for us to constantly reflect on where we are as a society and where we should be.
Exactly. You are there at the right point. And I think that our discussion, I think we can conclude that discussion. When you talk about democracy, you cannot take democracy as a single term. It should also include all other phenomena, maybe particularly gender, minority, all these ideas. So, particularly when we look into the idea like gender, you have been specifying that the problem with the gender is that, particularly in our society, is that there's a lot of internalization, maybe of this patriarchy. It has been, these things are being accepted as maybe like that. You are to be protected, you have to be empowered. So this kind of learning should be done with. Maybe we hope that a fine day will come when we will break up all this kind of internalization and will be educated. Our society, our youngsters will be more educated. As of now, we have more and more young girls coming into our institutions, and they are majority, are getting maybe 90-95% girls are in our classes. So a bright day is not so far away. We hope that.
I hope that you're right, but I think this is the work of generations, and I doubt that it can be achieved in one lifetime. But also, like, we can have classrooms full of women, but it does not necessarily change, because there has to be, like, people have to really kind of do this, like, challenge this at every step, every day, all the time, and even then it probably takes generations anywhere for this kind of thing to be, because, you know, as we are, it's always comfortable to live within the sorts of common sense prejudices that we have inherited, and it's always hard to question. So therefore, a good society, any society that strives to do better, is one where critical thinking is both encouraged, taken seriously, and that in itself will then lead to all of the other, you know, list of good things.
Thank you. So the Calicut University campus joins with your dream.
Thank
and
you.
hope that we'll find a day soon. Thank you. Thank you.
ടോക്ക് ഓണിൽ ഇന്ന് വെസ്റ്റ് മിൻസ്റ്റർ സർവകലാശാലയിലെ സെന്റർ ഫോർ സ്റ്റഡി ഓഫ് ഡെമോക്രസിയുടെ ഡയറക്ടറായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രൊഫസർ നിതാഷ കൌളുമായുള്ള അഭിമുഖമാണ് കേട്ടത്. അവതരണം കാലിക്കറ്റ് സർവകലാശാല പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ സയൻസ് വിഭാഗം മേധാവിയായ ഡോക്ടർ സാബു തോമസ്.